3, let's go. Okay, it says it's recording. Do you have a notification that it's recording?
I don't get a notification. I hope it works. You want to test it?
It says to me it's recording, so.
Okay, then we can start.
Okay. But once again, your video's not working.
Oh, it's funny because I see myself. I don't know, it's frozen.
Yes.
It is frozen. It's not moving. I'm moving and I don't see it. It's
strange.
It is very strange.
Okay, then all right, then before we proceed with the interview, maybe try turning the camera off and then turn it back on and see if that works.
Okay. Okay.
Okie dokie.
Not getting anywhere.
Alrighty. Well, okay. Well, so far I can hear your audio. Oh, but there seems to be an echo again. Let me see if this works. 1, 2, 1, 2. Do you hear an echo when I'm speaking?
No, I hear you perfectly.
Okay. All right. Hopefully, it's not going to be too distracting. Okay. Let's get right to it. Let's get right to it then. All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. We are once more joined by Alfred De Zayas, who is a grand independent international diplomat. He's been associated with the United Nations and has worked with the University of Geneva, right, Mr. De Zayas?
Well, with the Institut Universitaire de Haute Études Internationales, that was back years ago, but I have been the professor of international law at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, which is a private university.
Perfect, and we all know him as he was the Special Rapporteur who went to Venezuela to examine the effects of sanctions and to try to find a solution to the ongoing political crisis that is going on. And of course, he caused quite a bit of stir where he denounced what many of us feel is a grand imperial project in a war for oil and mining in Venezuela. And well, first of all,
Mr. Important contribution.
Excuse me?
I was going to say that the most important, long-lasting, sustainable result of my mission to Venezuela is that today there is an office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Caracas, which I proposed that it be established. We have 6 officers from Geneva who are now working in Caracas, and the High Commissioner was personally in Venezuela. So it's not just the completely politicized, one-sided attempt by the Grupo de Lima to overthrow Maduro. Human rights is an entitlement. Human rights is something that is positive. It's not naming and shaming. Human rights is helping people, helping a government to solve serious economic and other problems. And that is what the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is trying to do in Venezuela today, as opposed to what the Grupo de Lima and Luis Almagro of the Organization of American States are trying to do, which is massive interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign state with the view to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution, to introduce a, shall we say, thoroughly undemocratically selected individual who is nothing more than a puppet of Washington, and who will then open the great looting of the Venezuelan natural resources, which will then go to American investors and to the transnational corporations, et cetera, et cetera. So my mission put its finger on the cause of the economic crisis, which the mainstream media wants to refer to as a humanitarian crisis. I was in Venezuela, I walked the streets, I went into the supermarkets. Certainly in November, December 2017, there was nothing like a humanitarian crisis, notwithstanding all the fake news and the ocean of lies that we read in the New York Times and in the Washington Post, and unfortunately, in organs of what I call the human rights industry. As you know, I've been
and in your report, you said if there is a humanitarian crisis, it's not because of the Maduro government itself; it's because of the sanctions that the United States, the European Union, Canada, and it's Britain, and that's have imposed on Venezuela.
Well, certainly. I mean, that is clear as water. That's also the judgment of many professors of international law and many professors of economics who understand the dynamics of financial blockades and sanctions. And this idea is actually the same blueprint as back in 1970 when Salvador Allende was elected in Chile, and President Nixon at the time called in Kissinger and told him, we're not going to tolerate another alternative economic system in Latin America, and we're going to make the Chilean economy scream. So there were all sorts of maneuvers, machinations, really dirty politics and dirty financial politics against Chile. And when, even after 3 years of massive sanctions and economic war against Chile, Salvador Allende was still there. So it was necessary to kill him and get rid of him. And of course, there have already been attempts on the life of Maduro, organized from the United States, from Miami. And there's been total impunity as to those in the United States who have actually been engaging in what would be targeted assassination attempts against Maduro. But what concerns me most is the hijacking of human rights, the corruption of
And
human rights,
yes, and actually,
undermining of
and Mr. De Zayas, sorry to interrupt you, but just so that we have, I just wanted to mention that, that was actually the first two questions I wanted to ask you, is because if people want more background on it, they can go back to our previous interview, part 2 of our 3-part interview, where you talked about your trip to Venezuela and how you believe very strongly that this is Cold War, Monroe Doctrine, dirty imperial politics all over again. So, but all right. So, So my first question is can you give us a brief? Just give us a very brief update then on Venezuela, because I saw the news that a United Nations body is once more slamming Maduro for the abuse of human rights. So can you talk very?
I have
Yeah.
I have the report.
Yeah.
The report is great. Report is full of inaccuracies. It has methodological problems. It's anything but objective. It doesn't take into account any of the information available from the Venezuelan government that disproves many of the allegations that they have in that report. You have to think how this came to be.
Okay.
After the government of Maduro invited the High Commissioner for Human Rights to come to Venezuela, and after the office established its seat in Caracas, and it started doing exactly that, going to the prisons, interviewing victims, interviewing persons who are detained, etc., etc. After the office is doing this, the Grupo de Lima, which are this cabal of quislings from the various neoliberal governments in Latin America, they pushed a resolution through in the Human Rights Council to establish a so-called independent commission to examine the crimes of Maduro. Now, that independent commission was, or rather that very much dependent commission, dependent on the Grupo de Lima and dependent on the United States, that was established last year, 2019, and there are 3 members, all of them, a priori against Maduro, so anything but objective, anything but believable what is going to come out from them. And what was particularly annoying in the procedure is that they were named by the president of the council, of course, with under pressure. I mean, because there's a lot of shall we say, behind the scenes manipulations in the House. Unlike the posts of rapporteur, I mean, I was appointed rapporteur following an examination and interviews and a competition. It was vetting by a working group of the Human Rights Council. In this case, there was no vetting. In this case, there was no advertisement for anyone who would have been, shall we say, a stronger candidate to participate in this independent commission. They were just simply named. And of course, they were handpicked to do exactly what they did. So I'm not at all surprised in the result of this report. This report belongs in the dustbin of history, like so many other reports that have been filed, which have one purpose and only one purpose: not to help the Venezuelan people, not
and very
to
briefly,
the suffering of the Venezuelans, but simply to get regime change. That's it.
And very briefly, is this report has this report, which you call very biased, very distorted, and part of the ocean of lies, has this report gotten more attention from the international corporate state press as opposed to your report, which slammed
much more? I mean, it had already, before it was published, it just came out with the usual fanfare that you expect from the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal and CNN and the others. So there is method here. This is no accident. And they're going to try to push in the Human Rights Council for an extension of the mandate of this commission. And let us see whether that goes through. It is a major problem because it undermines the work of Michelle Bachelet in Caracas. It undermines the effectiveness of the advisory services and technical assistance that any number of United Nations agencies are providing in Venezuela. So it is not only a question of overlapping or duplication, they're actually working at cross purposes with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So they are what the Germans would call Sand im Getriebe. They are a monkey wrench thrown into the spokes of the wheel. And that is what is intended. And this is, of course, the chaos strategy that the United States has been using in the United Nations for decades to slow down or frustrate the positive work of the United Nations. And as you know, I'm writing a book called The Human Rights Industry.
Okay, and perfect. And that's a perfect segue to my second question. That's a perfect segue to my second question because as we talked about last time, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many NGOs that have a good reputation, although I'm starting to really question why they had those good reputations to begin with, have also been recycling a lot of State Department propaganda against Venezuela, but also Syria, the situation in Ukraine, even to a large extent China. So anyways, let's get to my second question, which is, can you talk to us briefly about a book you are working on about the dangers of what you call the human rights industry, and you talked about this project that you're working on last time you came on the program, particularly parts 2 and 3 of that interview. So talk to us briefly then about what you call the human rights industry and what you're going to try to expose in this book project.
Well, over the last 40 years, I have worked in the field of human rights as president of an NGO that works in human rights. I was for 7 years president of the Pen Club, poets, essayists, novelists here in Switzerland. I have been president of other NGOs. I have been, of course, professor of international law and professor of human rights law. I've had enormous opportunity of observing the academic side of the human rights industry. I have worked more than 20 years as a senior lawyer with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as Secretary of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, as chief of the petitions department, that is essentially registrar, like registrar of the European Court of Human Rights or of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and coordinator of a team of lawyers examining allegations of violations of human rights. So I've seen how the office works internally. And of course, I have had the opportunity of exchanging views and crossing swords with the diplomatic community, with a tremendous number of ambassadors, etc. And what I have observed is that human rights have been more and more instrumentalized for political reasons. They have been what I call weaponized, and there is endemic use of double standards, of selectivity, whereas the coup d'etat, or the attempted coup d'etat in Turkey led to tens of thousands of arrests, a tremendous number of killings, etc., under Erdogan in Turkey.
Yeah.
In Venezuela, there have been several attempts at a coup, and Juan Guaido, the leader of these coups, is still walking the streets. And you don't have a repression anywhere comparable to the repressions that you have, say, in Turkey or in Saudi Arabia or in many countries in Africa and Asia. I think Venezuela has a system under the rule of law. It has an attorney general, Tarek Saab, with whom I spent hours, who has a genuine, robust anti-corruption program and anti-police brutality program. He has started investigations against more than 700 police officers and military, of whom more than 150 have been convicted of abuse or have been disciplined because of abuse, so that the issue of impunity, which plays a role in the so-called report of the of this so-called independent commission, are disproven by the very existence of this very robust program of investigating allegations of crime and police brutality, more so than in the United States. I would say that it's far more impunity in the context of Black Lives Matter. There's far more impunity in the United States.
Mr. Zayas, Maduro, I don't know where you're getting your information, but Maduro is a bloodthirsty, Castro-like communist dictator, and he's repressing his people with impunity. He is impressing people with impunity, and he's being so violent towards all of those garimbas with their, with their little fascist little, shields, and so I don't know where you're getting your information from. I think you're watching way too much Russian propaganda, Iranian propaganda, and Castro propaganda.
Well, since I was on the ground, and since I had the opportunity of meeting genuine human rights organizations in Venezuela, non-governmental organizations, I maintain very close contact with Fundalatin, which is the oldest human rights organization in Venezuela, founded decades before Hugo Chavez, and with consultative status with the United Nations, and the Grupo Sures, and the Red Nacional de Derechos Humanos, etc. So I get my information primarily from civil society in Venezuela, civil society whom I know personally and whom I consider have credibility, because I also met with some anti-government, non-governmental organizations who get their financing from the United States, and organizations like Provea and others. That, of course, tried to persuade me, as you said, that Maduro is a bloodthirsty dictator, etc., etc. But I'm a lawyer. I need proof. I need evidence. And if they don't deliver the evidence, if they only use epithets, if they only use insults and propaganda, then I'm not part of this game. And that's why I'm saying these organizations have been hijacked. These so-called human rights organizations outside of Venezuela and in Venezuela have one goal in mind, a political one, not a human rights goal. Their purpose is to topple this government so that there can be the grand bonanza after a neoliberal regime is installed. And it will happen, if it does, like back in 2002 when Pedro Carmona successfully, for 48 hours, I mean, he did overthrow Hugo Chavez. That
And
was in
eliminated
April 2002.
Supreme Court justices and High Court justices
And 49 pieces of social legislation. And as I told the opposition in Venezuela, even if you were to topple the Maduro government, you're going to be president over 8, 9, or 10 million Chavistas, and they're not going away. So you cannot just simply erase the achievements of the Bolivarian revolution. And if you try to do so, you're going to end up with a civil war. And that is what could happen, except that these people live in their own world, in their own bubble. And it's regrettable. I don't think I succeeded in persuading any of them that they're not just the 1% that count, but there are millions of Venezuelans who do want to have health care, who do want to have the right to work, who do want to have decent lodgings. And as you know, the government has built and distributed more than 3 million new homes, which have been assigned to primarily families. So you must estimate that in these homes provided by the government for the poorer sectors of the population, you have actually accommodated about 12 million people. So, I mean, this is significant. And you cannot erase that. And if you try to do it, you'll end up having riots, you'll end up having civil war. So back to the general problem of disinformation.
yeah, what you call the human rights industry.
Yeah, but there are many, unfortunately, involved in it because the donors are corporations. The donors are so-called philanthropists who actually just want to maintain the status quo. They want to make sure that the world continues the way it is so that they are still billionaires tomorrow. So if there is a change in the socio-economic system of Venezuela and Bolivia and Argentina, et cetera, that poses a long-term threat to them. And they have succeeded in corrupting a tremendous number of so-called human rights organizations. And I see these operatives. I see them in the Pen Club. I see them in Human Rights Watch. I see them in Amnesty International. I see them in the International Service for Human Rights. And these are people who actually can be very eloquent. They master the human rights language. There's a special jargon, and you throw it around. And it actually convinces a tremendous number of people. And there are these mantras that if you repeat them often enough, people believe them. So when I went to Venezuela in November 2017, I had been lied to. I had read so much negative about Chavez and about Maduro, etc. And I had to be on the ground. I had to speak with the people. As I told you, I walked the streets incognito so that I could get my own impression. I didn't go around with my bow tie. And obviously I spoke with the churches. I spoke with the Jesuits. I spoke with the professors. I spoke with the students to get an impression. And that which I learned on the ground has absolutely nothing to do with the so-called reports of independent commissions and of the New York Times and of the Washington Post. I mean, they're all in it for one purpose, which is regime change. That, of course, is contrary to the Charter of the Organization of American States, but who cares? The fact is that the Organization of American States has been under a person who has subverted the Charter of the Organization of the American States. I'm speaking of Luis Almagro, someone who has subverted and had a very negative impact on the elections in Bolivia, which clearly Evo Morales had won. But the OAS lent its support to a coup d'etat. Imagine what corruption when the organization that should be promoting democracy actually promotes a coup d'etat, a vulgar right-wing putsch.
But the Organization of American States has always more or less been a pseudo body, an extension of primarily the United States, hasn't it?
Well, the United States finances most of it, so the United States sets the agenda. And someone who is contrary to the United States will never be Secretary General of the Organization of American States. And of course, headquarters of the Organization of American States is in Washington, D.C., a stone's throw away from the Congress. So I have very little respect for the Organization of American States.
And the Lima Group.
I have far more respect for the new organization established 2003, I believe, the CELAC, which encompasses 33 states, which also had very good declarations. I remember when they declared all of Latin America a zone of peace, not only a non-nuclear zone, but a zone of peace. That would have been a marvelous example for the world, which has not been followed. But in any event, this South-South cooperation, this attempt of Latin America to promote its own interests and not the interest of the American investor. That is something to be applauded. Now the new president of Mexico, López Obrador, AMLO, I mean, the new president of Mexico is trying to free Mexico of decades and decades and decades of neocolonialism from the United States. But it takes time. And experience has been that those countries that try to liberate themselves from the toxic influence of the United States, like Ecuador. You had Rafael Correa, that for 10 years was the president of Ecuador and did enormous social progress for the people of Ecuador, for the indigenous of Ecuador. All of his work, not all of his work, but nearly all of his work has been undone by his successor, Lenin Moreno. And the situation
and this human rights
today, it's a catastrophe, it's chaos. Yeah.
And this and very briefly before we get on to other topics, so this human rights industry you're talking about, you mentioned Ecuador, you mentioned Bolivia. The human rights industry has done a very good job at confusing people and putting this narrative that Correa was autocratic, that Evo Morales was autocratic, that Evo Morales was clashing with indigenous groups, that Correa was clashing with indigenous groups. And there is some truth. There is some truth to that because of their non-environmentally friendly policies of extracting oil and mining and so forth.
But far more environmentally friendly than the policies of Lenin Moreno or the policies of the predecessors of Rafael Correa. I mean, obviously, there's no precedent in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, in the United States, that is all good. On the other hand, if you are judging according to democratic principles, Evo Morales was a supremely democratic leader, and so was Rafael Correa, which is not the case of Lenin Moreno, and is certainly not the case of Ivan Duque in Colombia.
Or Sebastian Pinera in Chile.
No, it's a total disgrace, but you have to take into account that they own the press, they own the media, they own the information, and they simply do their best to try to convince the electorate that they are the good guys, that they have the interests of the people in mind, when they have only one interest. They want to keep the rich rich, and they want to keep the poor poor. They want,
but the human and the human rights industry, which I assume your book is is going to denounce. The human rights industry does this sort of fake fairness thing where they say Morales is as bad as the current Christian fascist that's in Bolivia. That even though the right-wing opposition in Venezuela has committed human rights abuses, and they do say this, hence why they say that both sides need to respect human rights. Both sides need to respect human rights, but they reserve their mightiest condemnation for Maduro or Chavez previously. And I've told you I was a reporter. I was a reporter at the Labor Party conference. I went to an Amnesty International panel at the Labor Party conference, and they were talking talking about how there's a lot of promise for a Jeremy Corbyn leadership if he was to become prime minister. And they talked a lot about the human rights abuse in Yemen, the Saudi the Gulf Western War in Yemen, and I politely confronted Amnesty International UK, saying you're talking about human rights abuses in Yemen and the Western Gulf War in Yemen and how they're just. But why aren't you condemning strongly the Western Gulf War in Syria, where the West and the Gulf nations have exported ISIS and have funded ISIS and other Islamists in Syria, and of course, and the reaction I got was, well, we condemn the human rights abuses of both the Assad government and the opposition in Syria. And when I also said the same thing about Venezuela. Why aren't you condemning the fact that the opposition is are all Western backed and are basically trying to launch a coup in Venezuela, and the human rights abuses that Chavistas have faced from the right-wing opposition, and of course, and again they use the neutrality cards.
of course, it's a farce, and they know it. I mean, anyone who has any experience in the field can see through it. You can see through it. I can see through it. Unfortunately, the masses fall for it. I mean, even, shall we say, enlightened colleagues of mine in the United States frequently fall for the propaganda that they read in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. So it's not an easy task. And now I address your listeners, because I'm sure that many of the listeners are aware of abuses and of manipulations and of the undermining of human rights principles. If you have concrete examples of things that you have seen the abuses, the manipulations by non-governmental organizations, but which is by so-called independent journalism, by the quality press, by civil society, by all of these operatives. Please send them to me, Alfred De Zayas at gmail.com. I am trying, and I have been collecting concrete examples of the corruption of human rights by
The human rights
diplomats,
industry.
by non-governmental organizations, by professors, by journalists, by staff of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, don't think that the staff of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is all people deeply concerned with humanity and deeply committed to human rights values. I mean, many persons in the human rights industries see their activity as a job. It gives them a good salary, it gives them a good medical insurance, and they don't want to rock the boat too much. So sometimes I think that the human rights industry is there not to advance the interests of the less advantaged, of the poor, of the disadvantaged. They're there to maintain that status quo that has allowed them a good life. That is what they basically want. So let's move to other topics. Again, I repeat my appeal to your listeners that you send me examples like I have been collecting of ambassadors being put under massive pressure by the United States. So United States ambassador picks up the phone and calls the ambassador of country X and tells, don't you dare vote against us in this resolution. Or if you vote with us, we will give you A, B, and C. So this is hardball human rights. I won't even call it human rights. This is hardball politics using human rights as the medium or as the vehicle to achieve, shall we say, the great victory of neoliberalism, what Fukuyama called at that time the end of history. The idea that we have won. It's a phone, I'll have to tell him not to bother. I'm still on the interview. Try to call in half an hour. Bye.
All right, before we get to another topic, there's a book I have to recommend readers because I often criticize NGOs, and it's this book called Paved with Good Intentions, and it's about how Canada's development NGOs have actually worked hand in glove with the Canadian government in maintaining an imperial order. And past guest on the show, Yves Engler, Canadian historian, journalist, NGO critic, and media critic, has also called out those NGOs that have propped up imperialism. His book, Left Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperial Canada, is a must get.
Well, there's been some very good stuff being published in Canada, and there is a young Canadian scholar called Tamara Star-Blanket. She is an Indigenous Cree, and she wrote a dissertation which was published by Clarity Press in Atlanta, Georgia, in 2019, which I reviewed. Brilliant dissertation on the genocide against the Indigenous of Canada. And of course, paved with good intentions. I mean, the language that the government has used vis-a-vis the Indigenous, it's soft language. you think that they actually want to do something good for the indigenous, whereas what they want is to steal the last natural resource of the indigenous, to ruin their lands, to do the logging, to do the prospecting, to do the oil extracting and mineral extracting, and then not even share the profits with the indigenous. It is hypocrisy to the nth degree, but actually soft, because they don't show their cards. They don't tell you, we're going to screw you. They
And
tell
yeah,
you,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. And that's a perfect segue to my next question. And also, the human rights industry has also thrown Julian Assange under the bus. And in case people can't see my shirt, it says I'm with WikiLeaks. The human rights industry has shamefully thrown Julian Assange under the bus, where the Amnesty International UK woman did not consider Assange a prisoner of conscience or a political prisoner, said he had to be sent to Sweden first, even though Sweden had already dropped the charges and a United Nations working group said that Assange has been arbitrarily detained. And of course, Nils Melzer has said that that this is a witch hunt. But we're going to
worse than a witch hunt. It is much worse than a witch hunt.
But we're going to talk. But unfortunately, because we're pressed for time, we're going to have to unfortunately not talk about Julian Assange. But
Yeah.
maybe we'll return to him later. But okay, you were talking about you were talking about indigenous rights, and the last time you were on the show, you mentioned to me that the United Nations, at least a body of it in Switzerland, was actually going to focus on indigenous rights, but make it more that it's not just, we all make nice speeches, and one of these days we're going to address your concerns, indigenous people. Sorry about that. So my question is, when we last talked, you mentioned to me during our correspondence, and we talked about it briefly on 1+1, how you wish there was a Native Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter movement. So let's talk about that. And why isn't there mass global protest and mobilization to address the plight of indigenous people? Because you said, as I mentioned, in the UN, in Switzerland, people are actually trying to hold meetings about how to address the rights and self-determination of indigenous people, and make sure that the international community acts on it now and not in never, never, never land where we have several decades of absolute nothing.
Well, let me read something out to you. There is, as you may or may not know, a movement initiated in Canada of the indigenous, and it's called Idle No More.
Yeah, I'm familiar with them. Yeah.
Now they are going to demand their rights, but they have been subjugated, suppressed, mobbed, harassed for so long that they have, shall we say, suffered a state of terror, a state of depression because of this genocide committed against them, and the fact that nobody has taken any interest in their suffering. So now the educated indigenous have taken on the battle. And there are more and more publications in the field. I have, of course, proposed the creation of an Indigenous Lives Matter movement, and I hope it will be picked up. But there were people already in the 1960s who realized the magnitude of the crime committed against the indigenous of North and South America,
Yeah.
and who actually said so in very clear terms. One of those persons is the late Martin Luther King Jr. And he wrote a book called Why We Cannot Wait. The book is called Why We Can't Wait. And let me give you a quote. I mean, this quote should be written in stone. This quote should be in every school. Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. End of quote. Now, this is Martin Luther King. Now, why isn't that taught in every school? Why don't we draw the consequences from that recognition by Martin Luther King? What do we have? A lame apology by Barack Obama of December 2009, which then was hidden away in an appropriations bill of the Congress. You can find it in the internet, but nobody knows about it because a tree fell in the forest and nobody heard it. You know, that's the thing. The press completely ignored it. Here you have an apology by Barack Obama to the indigenous for all the depredations and crimes that the whites imposed on them. You think that be in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal?
But did Obama even acknowledge that the injustices that indigenous people face, the other Jim Crow, the apartheid that indigenous people face is still ongoing?
No. No, he says that predation's in the past. And the idea is let's turn the page, let's work in the future together and forget everything that happened before. But the press doesn't want to come to grips with this. And historians, professors of history do not want to come to grips with this. There's a great book, by the way, which could not be published in the United States. It was actually published by Oxford University Press, but in Oxford, England, not in the United States. That is Professor David Stannard, and he's professor in Hawaii. And he published a book back in 1992, that is 28 years ago, under the title American Holocaust. And he describes the genocide of the indigenous in North and South America. So he describes the depredations, the crimes, the abuses of the Spanish hidalgos and the encomendados, etc. And that book should have actually stopped all discussion and say, gosh, this is so important. This is so perceptive. And the book is so amazingly well documented. I mean, it's not blah, blah. It is not a polemic. It is a scientific, scholarly work. Do you think that it is cited by anybody? I mean, I use it in my classes, but it is like if it didn't exist. So we don't have only the problem of fake news. We have the problem of fake history. And we have the problem of facts without consequences. Whereas if there is one crime committed by Maduro. That is magnified, and that you can read on every newspaper. Crimes committed against the indigenous, they don't matter.
Yeah.
So indigenous lives do not matter. That is what it has been. Native, I like it. Native lives matter. Very good, very good. So
Yeah.
that really should become generalized. That people say, obviously, we cannot undo the colossal damage done to indigenous peoples, indigenous culture over 400 years. That is not possible. But we can at least, for the survivors of the Holocaust, for the survivors of the genocide, at least we can make sure that these people can retain their culture, that these people can have a future, and basically they should all be billionaires, because we have stolen trillions and trillions of dollars of natural resources from the indigenous of America. Not only did we massacre them, but we have actually looted.
Well, and also, I actually, I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, but these are the facts. Native Americans, just in the United States alone, are killed way more by the police and are actually more overrepresented in incarceration rates and subjected to the new Jim Crow than even African Americans. Indigenous, the extreme, and we're talking extreme poverty that Native Americans face, indigenous Hawaiians, much of them homeless, Native Alaskans, the extreme poverty they face is the worst amongst the entire population of America.
Higher COVID-19 deaths, and that is not reported.
Exactly. Exactly.
Whether the Navajos or the Sioux or the Tingley, they are suffering far more than the rest of the American population, but that doesn't matter because they are indigenous. And as I said, that we owe them trillions of dollars in reparation, but the indigenous don't want our money. The indigenous essentially want their self-determination. The indigenous want to be left alone. They want to have their culture and their traditions and their beliefs. Obviously, we destroyed their economies. Obviously, we destroyed their way of life. So they do need a certain amount of reparation so that they can reconstruct their lives, that they reconstruct their societies. But it's not that we can just simply buy them off. I'm not proposing that we throw trillions of dollars to the indigenous. I am proposing that we respect them, that we respect their culture, that we respect their history and their traditions, and that we allow them once again to rebuild what they can rebuild, and then side by side with us, not being assimilated into the United States, but side by side as equal partners, that they can then contribute to our own welfare. That I would welcome. By the way, I'm going to have to cut. We could pick it up again because I assume that this is all oral, or you don't have any picture, and we can do it again with Skype when it works.
Yes, and I also have to mention before we cut this conversation is that Aboriginal Australians are the most overrepresented in prisons, even though they make up about.
Also, I know. I've been in Australia several times, and I know.
And there's an epidemic of police murders and apartheid. We have to use that word, apartheid. And yet, the plight of Aboriginal Australians, the plight of Native Americans, even the plight of First Nations, Canadians, and to an extent the Maori of New Zealand and the Sami people of the Nordic countries, does not get the mass level of people power protests, of solidarity protests, and people condemning them, unlike the Black lives, unlike the plight of Black Americans and the plight of Palestinians, which gets even more, which actually gets international attention and people condemning the human rights abuses of Israel. But Native Americans, First Nations Canadians, the Inuits, Aboriginal Australians and Torres Strait Islanders, and the Sami people and the Maori people, that does not get the mass attention it deserves, or all of these left-leaning people, waging a flag of solidarity, unlike Black Americans and the Palestinians.
Those who go for the bandwagon, those who go for the politically correct consensus victim, they're not really interested in the human rights of these individuals. They really don't care about Black Lives Matter. What they want is to have the feeling that they are participating in a movement, and basically is a form of conformism. They are joining, shall we say, the politically correct dogma. And since the Indigenous don't participate in that, the Indigenous are not considered even as consensus victims, they also do not matter, whether it be the Aborigines of Australia or the Maoris. By the way, the Australians, at least, the Australian courts have officially denounced, refuted, rejected the Western doctrine and definition of discovery and the idea of terra nullius, and in a very famous judgment of the Supreme Court of Queensland in Australia, subsequently adopted by the Supreme Court of Australia, Mabo against Queensland. In that case, it was recognized that the Indigenous, or the Aborigines, had title to the land, and enormous tracts of Australian land has been given back to the Indigenous, who are administering it in a manner far more ecological than the Europeans do. So that today Uluru, the whole complex of Uluru, is being administered by Indigenous. The whole province of Kakadu is administered by Indigenous. Large tracts of land in Queensland and also in Darwin in the north. So
unfortunately, those have all been. Unfortunately, those fragile gains and those minor victories have been clawed back because the Australian government did the intervention. And people should watch John Pilger's documentary Utopia so that they know what I mean.
Indeed. So let's continue this when you have an operative Zoom or an operative Skype. You can call me next week or the week after.
Okay. We were joined by 1+1 by our very special guest, Mr. Alfred De Zayas. This will be to be continued. We're going to try to get him back on because we had problems on Skype. I'm new to Zoom. So Mr. De Zayas, yes, so next time we have you on, well, we're going to talk more about the need for a global Indigenous Lives Matter, but also some other issues I want to talk to you about. But until then, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great weekend, and I look forward to getting back in touch and doing another interview.
Thank you, Youri. Until the next time, take care.
Solidarity. Ciao, ciao.